Welcome to today's Arthur W. Page Society conference call titled Page 1 Teleconference Authentic Advocacy Webinar. During the presentation, all lines will be in a listen-only mode. A question and answer session will follow the presentation, and instructions for asking questions will be given at that time. Thank you for your attention. I would now like to turn the conference over to your host, Mr. Gonring.
Good day, everyone. Welcome to this special Page 1 teleconference webinar. Today we'll be providing an advanced look at some key findings and recommendations included in the Page Society's upcoming white paper titled Authentic Advocacy, How 5 Leading Companies Are Redefining Stakeholder Engagement. My name is Matt Gonring of MP Gonring Associates, and with me, joining me today is Dave Samson of Chevron. Dave and I co-chair the Stakeholder Engagement work stream of Page Thought Leadership. And we've been working with our committee members, Mark Bain of Upper 90 Consulting and Ward White of Edelman, to produce this latest report. The Page Society will be issuing this next week, so look in your email for a link to the full paper. Mark Bain will also be moderating a panel discussion on this important topic at the Page Annual Conference later this month, for those of you that will be attending that. This webinar is part of a series that represents a joint effort between the Page Society and Page Up. The goal here is to take a deeper look at Page thought leadership work and to provide an opportunity to have a conversation about how it all relates to our experiences as senior communications professionals. Throughout this webinar, you're going to have an opportunity to ask questions via text that we can answer at the end of the presentation. And we'll also take questions via phone, which the operator will manage on our behalf. Finally, there will also be a brief survey delivered right after this webinar. We'd appreciate you take a moment to complete it and let us know your thoughts so we can continue to improve these experiences. I'll be starting today with an overview of the paper and its key findings, and later I'll turn it over to Dave for a more in-depth look at how he and his team at Chevron approach stakeholder engagement. And then after that, we'll open up to a Q&A. So our portion of the presentation should run roughly about a half an hour, and then after that we'll take it into as I said, into the Q&A. So by way of background, let me first mention that this report is the latest in a series that examines the Page new model for enterprise communications, which was brought up in the 2012 Building Belief Report. That report puts corporate character at the center, suggesting the foundation of all communications is the unique and differentiating character that defines an organization. That is, its values, beliefs, purposes, and actions. Page later issued a follow-up paper in 2014 that further examined this center portion of the model, featuring companies that exemplify how chief communications officers can activate, define, and align values across their own enterprise. This paper, titled Authentic Advocacy, is the next step, providing a closer examination of the outer ring of this model, which describes the steps taken to produce advocacy and action through stakeholder engagement. So now let's get into today's presentation, which, by the way, is really the culmination of a number of years of work. And this is we've approached this in a qualitative manner. And as you'll see, there's 5 logos. These are the 5 corporations who have been participants in this review. And our goal has been really to kind of examine, what is occurring today, understand the business landscape. What's the role chief communications officers are playing, and where is the opportunity to truly drive impact? So this concept of stakeholder engagement, again, has been something we've been bandying about for a while, and today you'll get a chance to get a sense at our first shot at it from a qualitative standpoint. So let me give a top-line kind of overview of the findings. Corporate character and corporate social responsibility are fundamental characteristics inherent in stakeholder engagement. They, in effect, they are the important foundation that enables stakeholder communications to be most effective. We'll talk today about the importance of a methodical and ongoing approach to stakeholder engagement, that it is not a one-time deal, and you'll get an inside view at the corporations who have been subject to this study to get a sense of how they've gone about it and where they've had success. And as indicated earlier, this is one of those studies that kind of reaffirms the importance of value and that direct values in an organization and that direct relationship between corporate social responsibility and stakeholder engagement. The concept of building these mutually beneficial relationships is, and you'll see this articulated throughout our presentation today, is really an enterprise. It has to be data-driven, it has to be disciplined, and it truly is an enterprise-wide approach. One of the things that's important to point out is that, chief communications officers are one of the few functional areas in most organizations that has a multi-stakeholder view, not unlike the chief executive officer. That multi-stakeholder view enables CCOs to see the interrelationships among various publics or constituencies and to be better equipped to help manage communications and manage issues surrounding those various important stakeholders. In addition to that, lots of things are occurring in business in general, not the least of which is social media and digital media in general, which is in effect given stakeholders a greater amount of power and influence, and that all has equal access. And important in relating to that, of course, is the concept of increased transparency. That is that no one can operate. Everything is pretty much visible to all stakeholders in our world of business today in some way, shape, or form. So what you'll hear borne out throughout this conversation is the importance of organizational dynamics. That is, how do things get done in your business, in your enterprise? And specifically, these 5 organizations will give a sense of how they've been successful in working within their organizations in different manners and with different stakeholders in being successful in driving stakeholder engagement. So let me go to the next slide. This was one of the first of our conversations today surrounding subjects of the study, and Lundbeck is one of the corporations that agreed, and Sally Benjamin Young is the Chief Communications Officer there. And one of the emphases there at Lundbeck is clearly that character and values are only as real as they are practiced. And the Chief Communications Officer has a key role in identifying, articulating, aligning, and communicating to various stakeholders. So in the circumstance of Lundbeck, one of the key findings of that is that values are integrated into everything that they do, and it permeates and emanates from the enterprise, and it has to be, the Chief Communications Officer is in a clear role of being clear, concise, concrete, and very specific. And at the end of the day, it's all about behaviors, and the behaviors obviously have to follow the values and the components of corporate character. I'll move on to the next slide. Cargill also, as many of you know, is a large food concern, and Mike Fernandez is the Chief Communications Officer there. And in that circumstance, Mike has given us a really good insight at Cargill as to the importance of collaboration, that is, establishing partnerships throughout and across the enterprise. As has been the case with many other aspects of communications, one of the greater impediments of being successful in collaboration is, territorial and turf issues. Mike's been particularly successful at driving stakeholder engagements from a central and coordinated source. That is, Mike's been fortunate in developing and earning a broader span of control with the communications function. Of course, it still comes down to a multi-function effort across the enterprise. Having said that, Mike's kind of merged functions allows for a much more coordinated and integrated approach in engaging various stakeholders. I'll go to the next slide. USAA is a classic case in point of a strong amount of emphasis on one primary stakeholder. Not that there's not emphasis on multiple stakeholders, but everything emanates from a primary stakeholder at USAA, and Wendy Strong is the Chief Communications Officer there. And of course, that primary stakeholder is their membership and their members. And everything emanates and is driven by member communications and member engagement at USAA. It's very much of a passionate and laser focus. If any of you have ever visited USAA's headquarters, you would see it throughout every experience of coming into the corporate lobby, from the way all of the employees speak. It's very, very much of a universal understood commitment to their members. And that focus is also enabled by being very data-driven. And Wendy has been able to drive a sophisticated and be involved in influencing a sophisticated level of data in truly understanding their membership and what's important to them. And they too have very important elements of corporate character, referring to them as pillars. And it's very much of a mission-driven organization. And of course, employees are a very key stakeholder in driving engagement with all key external stakeholders, and that extends beyond members. But as I said, a real strong primary emphasis on being member-focused and member-driven as a key dimension of stakeholder engagement. Another subject of this study is Southwest Airlines. Ginger Hartage leads the function of corporate communications there. And at Southwest, and many of you who have flown Southwest have experienced this, in effect, employees are at the center of their stakeholder engagement focus, philosophies, and efforts. They are, in effect, their differentiator to the marketplace. And Southwest does a really good job at acknowledging those values that are important to them in action by recognizing employees through things like how they're evaluated and spot bonuses. And pretty much everything around employees is intended to encourage value-driven behavior. And those of you who have flown Southwest and experienced Southwest, I'm sure get a sense of that primary emphasis on stakeholder engagement being employees at Southwest Airlines. Let me continue to move forward here. Again, another important component, and we'll speak to Lundbeck, is the importance of partners and partnerships. Sally speaks very strongly about the importance of listening and listening being a key dimension of stakeholder engagement with important publics. And along with that listening goes face-to-face. In other words, they don't engage important, influential stakeholders just strictly online or through other methods, but face-to-face. And their whole intent is to collaborate and to work jointly and find common ground. So it's a real balanced form of a partnership, and that's the way Sally likes to characterize it, as a partnership. And Lundbeck has been very successful in targeting specific stakeholders, listening to them, working with them directly, and establishing a mutually beneficial and collaborative rapport. Okay, but now building advocacy and advocacy of scale is all relative, and through many of the other research papers the society has undertaken, oftentimes folks get the perception that advocacy has to be on a large scale, that it's about engaging and influencing large numbers of stakeholders. Well, it's true that ultimately influencing reputation and managing stakeholder engagement through and effectively managing reputation is important, but advocacy of scale is relative. It's not always about large numbers. Sometimes it's about small numbers, and it's about mutually beneficial relationships that allow achievement of longer-term goals. So the takeaway and the learning about advocacy of scale is that every stakeholder is important, and regardless of size, and each have, of course, equal access to digital media and the opportunity to influence, various enterprises. So the key takeaway here is that it is advocacy is very relative. Advocacy of scale is in fact relative. So engaging stakeholders, so I'm moving to the next slide, is clear in its benefits, and that is articulated throughout this study in mitigating business risks and also in identifying business opportunities. So it's incumbent upon chief communications officers and communications teams to recognize and acknowledge key stakeholders as opportunities and not just distractions. All too often in the past, experiences have been that certain stakeholders and NGOs can be very negative influence on organizations and their ability to operate effectively. So they can be viewed as opportunities or distractions, and someone kind of has to take the lead in addressing that. So the only way to address that is, in effect, is to engage stakeholders. And one of the key learnings, one of the key takeaways from this report is that engaged stakeholders provide a much better opportunity to provide clarity and understanding as to what's important to them. Sometimes that does not always come across clearly, and by engaging them, it can become much more apparent. So as I go to the next slide, it really needs to be an enterprise-wide commitment. And, communicating culture, as I mentioned earlier, does come in the form of actions and behaviors. And engaging stakeholders is not a one-time deal. It's got to become an ongoing process. And really, there's no one better equipped in the organization than chief communications officers, and that's a consequence of our core competencies and kind of multi-stakeholder view. It just makes us better equipped to address stakeholder engagement than other functional areas. So in summary, the key takeaway and what's important to recognize and understand and acknowledge about stakeholder engagement and the learnings from this research is the key role of building corporate character. We know that's critical for reputation. It's particularly critical in the context of stakeholder engagement. And the role of working inside of our organization, of creating an enterprise-wide commitment, is a key role in effective stakeholder engagement, as are building rigorous systems and data-driven methodologies, and in organizing and coordinating and aligning the workforce around stakeholder engagement. So a key learning, of course, is this developing partnerships with stakeholders, and it's an ongoing opportunity. Recognize and acknowledge that scales vary, and to commit for the long term. These aren't one-time deals, and each of these 5 companies will demonstrate these steps in various ways, and as will be reported out in the paper. So with that, that's kind of the end of my kind of front end of this, and I'm going to turn it over to Dave Samson from Chevron, and then he's going to speak to specifics regarding Chevron's stakeholder engagement program, after which we'll turn it over for Q&A. Go ahead, Dave.
All right. Thanks a lot, Matt. Really appreciate the introduction. Let me just start by saying I also want to extend my thanks to the other participants in this process. I think what USAA is doing with respect to engaging the families of military members is extraordinary. I think what Ludbeck is doing in terms of really treating patients as individuals as opposed to just one large cohort is extraordinary. I think what Cargill's doing to find common ground with NGOs in order to provide better outcomes and benefits to their customers is terrific work. And we all know the benefits of engaging your employees to have a better customer experience, which is being demonstrated day in and day out by Southwest Airlines. So the work they're doing is not only a reflection of the communications teams inside the organization, but it's really a reflection of the leadership of those organizations and their commitment to engaging their key stakeholders. So I just wanted to say that up front. I think before I get into some key points I want to make, let me just give you a little bit of background on who Chevron is. Some of you may know us, some of you may not, but we're the third largest company in the United States and one of the largest energy companies in the world. In 2013, our revenues were $230 billion, our earnings were $21 billion, and our market cap was $240 billion. So by any definition, we are big. I can't escape that fact. But let me just give you a sense of the scale of the industry, because the industry is really big. If you look at the Fortune 500 and you look at the top 10 companies in the U.S., 4 of the top 10 companies are energy companies. If you look at the Global 500, 7 of the top 12 companies in the Global 500 are energy companies, and that's both publicly owned companies like my own, as well as state-owned oil companies like CNOOC in China. So the size of the industry is extraordinary. And so, the commitments and what we do has to match our scale. In the energy business, we're driven by geology. Inside Chevron, geologists like to say that it's all about the rocks. And what they mean by that is we go to where the resources lie. And oftentimes this means that we have to go into some of the most challenging places in the world, both from a geology standpoint, the North Sea, the Deepwater Gulf of Mexico, places like that, as well as geopolitically. It can be extraordinarily challenging, as we're seeing today in parts of the Middle East and particularly in Iraq and Kazakhstan, in Kurdistan and places like that. So we go to where the resources lie, and to be successful, we have to adapt to that geology. We use ingenuity and technology to get the resources out of the ground economically, safely, and responsibly. But when we go into these communities, our business and our projects span decades. So when it comes to building lasting stakeholder relationships, we have to take a similar approach. I think one of the ideals of Arthur Page has always been that businesses operate at the pleasure of society, and that couldn't be more true than it is in our business. We have to earn the license to operate, and we have to earn it every day if we're going to maintain that license to operate. But what does that mean? What does it mean to me as the person responsible for communications? It means in my role that I must understand the geology, if you will, above the ground, the social geology, the geopolitical geology. The geology of communities in which we operate also differs greatly from geography to geography. And the geology above the ground can be equally complex depending on where we're doing business in the world. It's complex in places like Kurdistan today. It's complex in the Ukraine today. It's complex in Indonesia. It's less complex in the Gulf of Mexico, but some would argue inside our company that's equally complex in California. But the bottom line is, we have to earn our license to operate, and we have to do that day in and day out. And so when we engage with stakeholders, it's a participatory process. And I think maybe you can go to I want to make 3 points as part of our discussion today. The first is that, it all starts with engagement and direct engagement, one-to-one engagement. Then I think you have to take a systematic approach for identifying, prioritizing, engaging, and tracking stakeholder issues. It's got to be an analytical process. And then finally, it's got to be participatory. The days of companies going in and just determining what's right for a community and making decisions without involving them are long past. So why don't we go to that next slide? And this is a point I can't underscore enough. It all starts with direct engagement. We talk a lot today about advocacy at scale. We talk a lot about the channels of communications, whether it's earned media, owned or shared media, paid media. But at the end of the day, if we're going to drive business value for our organizations, we have to engage directly. So, for example, if you're an investor and you want to decide that maybe you want to move your money across the street from ExxonMobil to Chevron, you're not going to do that unless you get direct access to the leadership of our company. And then what we do is we use all these other channels of communications and other engagements to really leverage what we're doing directly to reinforce what people hear through direct engagements and to show them, the actions that we're taking so they can see it firsthand. And you can just go through the list. That's true with government heads. I mean, in our business, we're going into other countries and we're extracting their natural resources. So our partners in many cases are governments. We have to engage policymakers if we want smart policy. We can't just sit on the sidelines and complain. We've got to actually get in there and try to make sure that the policies are smart. And, industries get accused of being anti-regulatory, but I think what they really want is smart regulation. And so to get that, you have to engage. NGOs, as we've seen with Cargill, obviously, finding common ground is something that everybody should be doing. And I will tell you that when you sit down with people that on the surface may be viewed as your critics, most often there's a lot more common ground than there are points of departure. And then obviously you can just go through the list of those stakeholders. And then again, to the other point is we then use channels of communications to really leverage and optimize those engagements, to really build kind of an echo chamber, if you will, that drives other people to see the value of engagement with an organization. But I would also make the point that advocacy, just for advocacy's sake, isn't enough. We need advocacy to actually lead to action. We need people to want to invest in our company. We need people to want to come to work for our company, particularly in a talent-constrained environment. We want people to view us as, the investment of choice. And we want people to support us on issues and policies and things of importance to our organization. And so I always try to make that point that despite everything we have through social media today that allows us to reach broader groups of stakeholders, engage with them more directly, if you only engage through virtual channels, you're only going to have a virtual relationships, and relationships that last are built directly. The next point, I really want to hit on is that, I think it takes a systematic approach. As I said, stakeholder engagement is fundamental to our business at Chevron. Lasting relationships are not built at the corporate center. And I would argue that if you talk to any of the other participants in this study, they would tell you that. It's built on the ground, across multiple geographies. It's built through the direct engagement of your employees with your customers. It's built through people that are on the ground working with local NGOs, not just international NGOs. It's work by engaging patients and the patients that you have, and rather than just looking at them as one kind of homogenous group of people. And we know what USAA is doing in terms of being able to turn strangers into families. So it's very important to have a systematic approach, but relationships aren't driven from the center. So for this reason, we take a very deliberate and systematic approach to stakeholder engagement at Chevron, and depending on where we're doing business, stakeholder engagement can account for the bulk of a country manager's time. I was involved last year in some training programs for 37 managing directors that are responsible for key countries in which we do business, and in some cases, their responsibility for engaging stakeholders within their communities and in their local communities and within the countries in which they operate was anywhere from 50 to 100% of their time. And it was 100% of people's time where we were going into communities where we'd never had a presence before. So we were leading with stakeholder engagement. We were not leading with exploration. So that's an important point. The stakeholder engagement is important enough at Chevron that we've actually built it into what we call our operational excellence management system. So we've made stakeholder engagement a part of our management system inside the company. And what that means is that it's a comprehensive means for systematic management of a number of company processes, including stakeholder engagement. By taking, a deliberate approach, we're able to identify and manage the risk we encounter across our global business operations. And so stakeholder management is a management process and system, just like safety is a management process and system inside Chevron. So we give it that level of importance. And then the other thing, having a very systematic approach allows you to do. It allows you to ensure consistency across the organization. And that's very important in a company like ours that is spread out across the world. We operate in many challenging geographies. And as I said, these relationships are largely built on the ground, but it ensures consistency of our approach. And because it's part of our management system process, it's subject to formal and regular reviews of the progress so that we can continuously improve it. And I'm glad to answer any questions you might have on that when we come to the Q&A. And then finally, it's a participatory process. And let me give you one example. We've operated in the country of Nigeria for more than 40 years. Nigeria, for anybody that's familiar with it, is the most populous country in Africa, has more than 130 million people. Our operations lie largely in one part of Nigeria that's called the Niger Delta. Within the Niger Delta, there's more than 30 million residents that live inside 14,000 settlements. So that's 30 million residents in 14,000 settlements. 70% of the people in the Niger Delta earn less than $1 a day. Their life expectancy is 47 years of age. There's high unemployment, lack of government infrastructure, and as a result of that, there's been a history of inter-ethnic conflict. There's been a history of lack of sustainable investment, and there was a history of violence and attacks on the oil industry inside Nigeria, particularly in the Niger Delta. In fact, in 2003, our facilities in that area were attacked, and we had, over the course of that year, more than $1 billion in damages done to our facilities. And we've also had to endure, kidnappings and having employees killed. So it is a tough place to do business. And so how did we find a way to continue to operate in the Niger Delta? Why would we continue to operate there? Well, historically, our approach would be to go in, do a social assessment. Based on that social assessment, we would typically fund and build schools. We would fund and build hospitals. We would fund and build power and water facilities. We would set up micro-lending programs. In other words, historically, we would go in and we decided what we felt was best for that community. And so in 2005, and so that approach really wasn't working. So in 2005, we took a new approach, and we went into the Niger Delta, and we established 8 regional development councils. So we worked with the community leaders to establish global memorandums of understanding. And those global memorandums of understanding were designed to address unemployment issues, to build community capacity so they could actually really become a sustainable community. It worked to embed transparency and accountability into all the projects. And those memorandums of understanding were designed to end the cycle of dependency while also pursuing peace and stability in the region. Because in the Niger Delta, you have, with all those different 14,000 different villages and things, you also have a lot of, as I said, inter-ethnic conflict. And so trying to bring people together to have a common vision about their community was what was part of this global memorandums of understanding through the regional development councils. So in short, touching back to a point that Matt made, we've taken a much more authentic approach to stakeholder engagement in the Niger Delta. Our aim was to empower the community, to give them real ownership in the process, and to actively involve them in taking control of their own destiny. And that, I believe, is what ultimately builds a sustainable community. And so with that, I can talk about other examples, but with that, I think, Matt, we might be best to open it up to Q&A.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Dave. Very, very helpful. Okay, I'll ask our operator, Nick. We are ready for questions. I know we've got a number in the queue as well, so we'll start out with seeing if we've got any live at this point. Nick?
Thank you. At this time, we will begin the question and answer session. To ask a question, press 0 followed by a 1 on your touch-tone phone. Questions will be answered in the order they are received. If you have a question, press 0 followed by a 1 now. And please hold for a moment as our system compiles your responses. And while we wait for the questions, I didn't know if you maybe wanted to answer some of the text questions?
Yes, I would. We're happy to do so, and thank you all for joining again. There's a question regarding how things are different today in terms of the role of the Chief Communications Officer in the environment and what kind of influence that has. I'm going to turn that over to Dave, but before I do, it is indeed a different world than it has been even 10 years ago. The requirements of transparency and, of course, the digital nature of communications and the global nature of business in general has, in effect, increased the CCO's breadth of responsibilities and role. Dave, you want to expand on that a bit in terms of how things are different? I know you've been at Chevron a good number of years. Maybe you can give a sense as to what you've seen in terms of the rules of the game today as it relates to stakeholder engagement in comparison to some number of years ago, if you could, please.
Well, I think you've touched on some of the issues out there. Obviously, social media is playing a key role. If you think about it today with the number of smartphones in the market, there are 1 billion journalists out there, but there are also 1 billion jurors and jurors out there. So people can render in real time their pleasure or displeasure with your organization. People can create content and put it out in real time today. So and that leads to the point that everything's transparent. If you doubt that fact, ask Ray Rice about transparency. But everything is transparent today. We live in a world of radical transparency, and we also, because of social channels, as you pointed out earlier, stakeholders are more empowered. So if you're an individual that feels an issue is important, you can take up that issue and drive real change. I remember looking last year at some of the stuff that was taking place in Brazil, for instance. There was a real outrage over the increase of bus fares, something as innocuous as that, and it was driven by, it was started by a single woman. And within a matter of weeks, there were millions of people on the streets across Brazil sharing their frustration, not only about increasing bus fares, but corruption in government and stuff. And so that's what we mean when we talk about more empowered stakeholders. So what that really means is that the stakes have never been higher. And companies have to understand the world in which they operate, and that and that there are changing expectations of stakeholders, and they've got to, again, be prepared to engage with those stakeholders one, to listen and understand their concerns, and then to talk about what they're doing to be really part of the solution as opposed to part of the problem.
Thank you, Dave. Nick, anything in the queue yet?
Not at the moment, but as a reminder to our audience, you may ask a question on your touch-tone phone by pressing 01 now.
Dave, let me pose a question to you, if I could, please. Chevron, as you've indicated, is indeed a behemoth in terms of size, scale, and scope. How do you? Is it been your experience that the concept of listening and engaging stakeholders is kind of fundamental in terms of a business philosophy, or has it evolved? And in terms of recognition and importance of connecting directly with stakeholders, can you expand on that?
Well, I would say that what's evolved has really been our approach to stakeholder engagement. I mean, one of the things I found when I came into this industry, particularly, on the ground where we're doing business, whether that's exploration or whether we have a refinery or a manufacturing operation, is we can't do business if we don't engage our stakeholders. You can't do business in a refining community, for instance, where you have a refinery without engaging beyond your fence line. You can't get the permits you need to explore for oil and natural gas if you don't engage local stakeholders. So I think one of the things in our industry, we fundamentally understand that our license to operate is driven by our key stakeholders. But what is changing is, taking a much more sophisticated approach and systematic approach to stakeholder engagement. And just one simple example, we went into Poland probably 3 years ago now. We didn't have any operations in that community, and as we went in, the typical people that come to mind when you're looking to get exploration permits are regulatory officials, government officials, maybe even the local mayor within that community. But in the end, the most influential stakeholder in the communities where we were operating in Poland was actually the parish priest. Something that we hadn't anticipated. And so, those are the kinds of things you learn when you actually get in and start to engage on the ground.
A real good example of scale being relative.
Right.
One of the questions that's been posed on the queue is for us to address the echo chamber concept. No expansion on the question beyond that, but echo chamber, as I get it, by definition, is the concept of ideas and beliefs that are amplified through kind of being reinforced and through repetition. I'm not sure. I guess, Dave, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, if I look at when I think of the echo chamber, every company, there's a conversation happening about that organization or institution. That conversation is by your employees, that conversation is by your investors, that conversation is by your business partners, that conversation is by your critics. So there's a conversation happening every day about our organizations. Communications people have historically tended to focus heavily on media, for instance. Media, in my mind, is more often a byproduct of the echo chamber than a driver of the echo chamber, although they can certainly drive it. If you look again, go back to what happened with Ray Rice and TMZ yesterday, clearly that's media driving the echo chamber. But the fact of the matter is, we have to be attuned to the conversations that are taking place, and we have to, use communications tools in order to really make sure that our point of view is a part of that echo chamber. And our aim is to have more people aligned with our point of view than opposed to it. So when I talk about media as a byproduct of the echo chamber, if a lot of people support your point of view and say, what you're doing, your safety practices are strong, all these things, then that actually becomes noteworthy and newsworthy to journalists. If there's conflict in the echo chamber where you say you stand for one thing and your employees say they've experienced something entirely different. That's conflict in the echo chamber, and that's also newsworthy. So oftentimes the media, whether it's the social media or traditional media, is a byproduct of that process, but they can also drive it. But that's what I mean when I talk about the echo chamber.
Okay, good. Dave, I'd like you to just kind of expand on, traditionally, the communications and or public relations function has had kind of traditional functional accountabilities. With us dealing with these, complex organization and the stakeholder matrix, the responsibilities go much beyond kind of a functional accountability into, an insight kind of accountability and understanding the various dimensions of the matrix, if you will. And I think every organization is at a little different point along that kind of development continuum. Can you speak to your organization and how that works most effectively in recognizing and acknowledging the importance of, in such a large organization, of that multidimensional accountability, if you will?
Well, look, I mean, inside Chevron we're big, but my experience has been the same inside when I was at Levi's, when I was at IBM, when I was at Oracle. In order to have any kind of influence beyond your function, you have to, first of all, you got to be a business person. You got to understand the business, because if you don't understand the business, you will never be taken seriously. So that's job one for any communications person. You should view yourself as a business person first. And then it's built on, you have to build relationships and you have to demonstrate real value. Telling people what you do is important won't get you there. You have to show them about and demonstrate to them the value that your function brings, and that's what in turn gives you influence across an organization. And I would argue that we are, as we don't make business decisions from the communications function, we influence business decisions. And so it is an influence model. And I would also tell you that on any issue of importance, seldom is there consensus about the right approach. And so the ability to exert influence on a range of issues is important. But you also have to understand that there are trade-offs. I hear all the time from, outside communications consultants that, and I know people on the phone have heard this, if they just took our advice, they wouldn't have this issue. But when you sit where I sit, there are lots of considerations that come in to every decision you make. Some of those are trade-offs between, conflicting stakeholder concerns. Some of those are financial issues. Some of those are human resource issues. Some of those are legal issues. And so every major issue is multidimensional. But you have to, in order to have any influence, you have to understand that, and you have to be willing to pick the right bites inside an organization.
Well, good. Continuing on that strain, Dave, perhaps, you might want to, one of the questions that came in the queue is, how do you coordinate with, other functional areas like legal, HR, and other corporate staff? Is that kind of a given, embedded, or how does it work at Chevron, please?
Well, I think, it started with, if I step back 10 years ago, I think we were disconnected from the business, and the perceived value that we offered was low. So our engagement with the business was low, and our perceived value was low. So that shouldn't be a big surprise to anybody. So we got engaged. We aligned ourselves with the business, and then we earned a seat at the table. And there's always been this kind of notion of the chief communications officer or the head of communications, or in my case, public affairs, needs to have a seat at the CEO's table. What the reality is, we need to have a seat, and the people within our respective teams have to have a seat at many tables, because most decisions aren't made at the center. It's not unlike stakeholder engagement. It's happening on the ground. So if you don't have a seat at many tables, you're not going to be successful.
Thank you. I know we've had a little bit of a logistical issue with some of the calls coming into the phone. Nick, anybody live at this point?
We do have currently two participants in the question queue. And the first question will be with Kathy Fitzgerald from PSE&G. Please go ahead, Ms. Fitzgerald.
Oh, thanks a lot. My question is either to Matt or Dave. I think actually, Dave, your title's Public Affairs, so I'm going to presume that the kind of advocacy model you're talking about really almost requires public affairs and public relations to be together. So that's one part of the question. And the second thing I think that would help all of us is to have specific examples of things that you advocated for and how they were helped by specific relationships. And maybe for you, Matt, examples of companies that couldn't get a business objective that they wanted because they hadn't developed long-term relationships.
Okay, let's first dig it in pieces. Dave, I guess the first concept is PR and public affairs together.
Yeah, so just the way we're structured, public affairs actually is really much more corporate communications. So my responsibilities are corporate communications, corporate marketing and branding. I'm responsible for our social channels and web properties, and and then all aspects of what falls typically under corporate communications. But and then there's a sister department that's government affairs that really does the direct engagement with elected officials, with regulators, those sorts of folks. And the woman that runs government affairs for us is a peer of mine, and we're joined at the hip on a lot of issues, because again, what she's doing through direct engagement with policymakers or elected officials, I'm driving the communications, the echo chamber, if you will, in support of those engagements. So if they're talking directly about, for instance, climate policy to somebody, then I obviously am making sure that our position on climate policy is more widely known in the broader echo chamber. So, or if we're dealing with tax issues, whatever it might be. So we're joined at the hip on a lot of those.
Who sets the agenda?
Huh?
Who sets the agenda for what you're going to advocate for? Where does that occur?
Well, that occurs with our strategic business plan on major issues. So if you look at major issues like hydraulic fracturing, and there's a third leg to the stool. There's my leg. There's the government affairs leg, and there's what we call corporate public policy and corporate responsibility. That's the third leg of the stool. So we jointly set the agenda, and we're jointly accountable for that.
Let me take the second part of your question, Kathy, was the surrounding companies that could not ultimately get this together. I'd like to just say that doing this kind of research requires a kind of a cooperative spirit with each of the entities that have been participants, and that means kind of getting an inside view, if you will. And that's not always so easy to get at, frankly, particularly with a sensitive area in terms of engaging NGOs and other key areas. So I don't have good examples for you in terms of companies that have not. The world is full of them. But our intent, frankly, is that this research informs the potential of a next level of a quantitative approach, more than likely the next go-round. And so this kind of puts a stake in the ground. I think gives a really good understanding of what some very progressive entities are doing in terms of organizing, structuring, and formulating what is evolving toward a new model, if you will, of stakeholder engagement. But that's kind of where it stands. And what I'd like to do is, we're nearing the end of our hour today. I think we've got one more call in the phone queue. If we could take that, and then we'll wrap up after that, please.
Absolutely. The next question comes from Ms. Kathleen Kelly from the University of Florida. Please go ahead, Ms. Kelly.
Thank you. Hi, it's actually Dr. Kelly, and I only mention that because my question might seem basic to practitioners. Dave, it's directed at you because you specifically use the typology of paid, earned, owned, and shared media. And yet when you talk about engaging stakeholders, you really talk a lot about interpersonal communication. Into what category does interpersonal fall? And this is merely a teaching tool. I need to learn this so I can teach my students.
Well, I mean, I think it's probably the most important. Again,
I do too.
And I think you raise a very key point because again, you can't build lasting, meaningful relationships with stakeholders if you don't engage them directly. If you don't sit down with them, if you don't understand their concerns, if you don't understand their interest, and so the ability to listen, the ability to articulate an informed but not an overzealous point of view, all of those things are critical in order to build credibility, and it ultimately, if companies want to be trusted, if companies want to be understood, if companies want to be valued, if companies want their issues to be supported, they have to engage, and it starts with some level of strong interpersonal capabilities.
Which one of those should you and I start a new typology and add interpersonal to this three-part typology that's being used so much nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, when I look at the earned media, owned and shared media, and paid media, I see those more as ways in which to amplify, share our stories, or to activate people to take action. But I think the interpersonal comes on the very front end, which is where I started. Is that step number one is direct stakeholder engagement. I think it was Richard Edelman that coined the phrase, we're in the era of public engagement, and I couldn't agree more.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, we want to be respectful of everyone's time, and we went into this planning an hour. We're right at that, and I'd like to kind of wrap up by thanking the member companies, specifically Dave today, and of course all of our colleagues from the member companies who have participated, and Mark Bain for the hard work he put into the research, and Ward White, who contributed as well along the way. And I would encourage you to look for the report. As I said at the beginning, this will be issued in about a week. We'll probably do a little bit of in addition to launching it at the Society's annual meeting, it will be launched via many of the media that are interested in this kind of a topical matter. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we'll appreciate your time. Can I just add one point, Matt? Sure. Yes. I know there's some questions that didn't get answered. If people want to shoot me an email at Dave Samson. Or Dave Samson at Chevron.com. That's one word, Dave Samson at Chevron.com. I can either answer you that way, or we can set up a time to talk. I'd be glad to answer some of the questions that weren't answered on today's call. Okay. To our colleagues from the Page Society as well, thanks so much for orchestrating and organizing, and thanks again for everybody joining, and have a good day.
Thank you all for your attention. This concludes today's conference call. All participants may now disconnect.